Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In Season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome today to the Thriving Leaders podcast. So today I've got Greg Pickering from AFCA. This is the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. So AFCA was established back in November 2018 and they replaced 3 legacy bodies that existed before. So this serves as Australia's single free independent financial dispute resolution scheme for consumers and small businesses. Over the last 6 years, the workforce has tripled in size to meet the demands, especially in scam-related complaints, financial hardship, and banking and finance complaints. I was really interested in finding out more about AFCA's story because for an organisation that deals with complaints day in, day out, they have extremely high employee engagement results. And they've also won lots of awards, such as the Best Place to Work. So Greg, who is the Senior Manager of Insurance at AFCA, has kindly come along to share some of his perspectives. So Greg has a really diverse background in arts, hospitality, retail, utilities, sales, financial services. What can't this guy do? And for over a decade, Greg has led high-performing teams through really complex and evolving environments. And his approach is really grounded in clarity, respect, and meeting people where they're at. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Very exciting.
Yeah. So before we get into talking about thriving teams, because I've got lots of questions to ask, I know that you're a seasoned podcaster yourself. So tell me a little bit about your podcast.
Oh gosh, very much unrelated to my work, Claire. But yeah, I've been doing a podcast for almost 8 years now. It's a Dungeons and Dragons comedy podcast. And we do live shows at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival each year. So yeah, no stranger to the mic, that's for sure.
Awesome. Oh, well, maybe you can draw on your comedy and Dungeons and Dragons knowledge into the session today too.
It's actually amazing how many of the skills that I use in playing Dungeons and Dragons and managing live audiences, particularly in those interactions, it's amazing how much of that I use in my day-to-day practice as well. And in fact, some of the core tenets that I use as a manager that have been the most successful are things that I learned in sort of arts circles, theatre circles, or performance circles, because often there's a lot of empathy in those spaces and a lot of emotion when performing. So it's been very helpful and a nice creative outlet as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a skill. I remember co-facilitating with a guy called Jeremy Dooley, who is a comedian as well, and even him drawing on a lot of his facilitation skills to do stand-up comedy and vice versa. I think there's lots of transferable skills there, that's for sure.
Way more than I expected, that's for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. So I reached out to AFCA. I know a few people who work there, and when I spoke to the people team, they recommended you as an awesome leader to speak to based on some of the work that you've done leading teams. So tell us a bit about your role at AFCA and the team transformation that you've led.
Well, yeah, thanks, Claire. So a senior manager in insurance at AFCA. I have a number of leaders that report to me and then their reports as well. I'm responsible for looking after. So it's an operational area where we receive complaints that are still ongoing and we help the parties to understand the requirements of those. We engage in negotiation and mediation. It's a high conflict environment and the parties, particularly complainants, what we know complainants, which are consumers, come with a long train of stress, inconvenience, which comes along with any insurance matter. to be honest. And so there's a lot of conciliatory action that we take to bring people on board to the process that we engage in, to help them feel supported and trusted, and to ensure that they have the knowledge that they need to best sort of represent their position.
Yeah. And so when you're brought in, it was to lead some team transformation. So what was currently happening at that time?
Yeah, great. When I came in, I took over, I think, 8 or 9 teams, and 2 of those were in a separate technical space. So most of my teams are general insurance, which is the normal stuff you come across, like your car or your home. Teams were focused on life insurance, which I'm sure, like, if you understand anything about what that is, most people have it under their superannuation account by default. They might not even know, but it's the kind of insurance that kicks in when things are really bad, when there's a health condition going on, usually chronic or terminal, that's affected every part of that person's life. And so these are like very highly charged, very emotional, very difficult situations. And also the technical part of those cases is complex, is more complex than many others. And I've worked in a lot of different sort of jurisdictions, areas, disability, utilities, insurance, superannuation. These ones particularly, very high technical barrier. And so this team that I came into looking after, the 2 teams, very highly tenured, very highly skilled teams that had been very consistent for a long time in their practices. But there were challenges in engaging with those teams early. It was something that I had to very much take time with, to understand where they were at and what the challenges were that they were facing. And there was a real imbalance between the 2 teams. One at essentially like perfect engagement level with a score of 100, and the other team much lower, with a number of factors feeding in. So there was consistent underperformance as a group. So when we look at performance, we look at sort of technical space, or what we would call stream. And that stream had been underperforming against expectation for a really long time.
So you've got a team with 100% employee engagement. So they're really happy to be at work. They're energized and engaged in the work they're doing, but they're not performing, is what I'm hearing.
That's
So
right.
what did you do to uncover or get beneath the surface of what was really going on?
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was a long process, and I'm lucky to have gone through many transformation processes before. And so I've had the opportunity to try and fail, fall down, or make mistakes, and learn more about my practice and the needs of others, and understanding the balance of that, and diverse audiences as well. And so, like, I brought a lot of lessons and experience in this with me, which led me to start with a very slow and gentle approach. And that was about discovery of what the challenges were for these teams, how they were feeling, what they felt hard, what elements they felt were not fair to them around practice and opportunity. Because my first step is around building trust with those teams I love to speak. I've got a podcast. I love to talk. I love to listen. But all of those things are, in my experience, just words, and people don't actually build that trust until those words are followed by action. And engaging with those teams in the first instance was really about demonstrating to them that the respect that I was saying that I had for them, the respect for their technical capability and skill set, was backed by me taking on challenges that they saw and giving them opportunity. So one particular part was around career progression. For both of those teams, they felt the career progression opportunities were incredibly limited, and they really didn't get the opportunity to step up into other roles. And so one of the first things that I did with them was build career pathways for them, and then demonstrate and proactively ask them, who is interested in this? who would like to step forward, who feels like they're not getting those opportunities. And I built bespoke opportunity pathways for each of those people and moved them the first step in that, which over time that's shown there's 3 of them now that have moved into management positions from those tracks, which is just, brilliant to see and a reward, but and a reflection of the skill that we were acknowledging. But just taking the first step on that journey helped to show them that I would take action based on what we were talking about, that I truly did feel the things that I was saying, and that I put my money where my mouth was.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is like being curious and asking questions and really listening to the responses, but then actually taking action based on what you've heard as well. Because I do find, although you had glowing employee engagement results, that a lot of organizations survey people, get all this feedback, but they don't actually take any action. And yeah, actually
Right.
listening to what the challenges really are.
Totally agree. And I think those engagement surveys are brilliant. And I've spent a lot of time disseminating results, breaking them down, trying to understand what's telling me. I think with those surveys, they're often quite large, and the element that feeds into the engagement score is often quite narrow. And there's so much more information in there about how people are feeling, about what it is that they find challenging, that you can unlock to unlock potential in teams. And as you said, really build strong trust, which to me is absolutely foundational to any sort of progress.
Yeah. It sounds like you've listened to your people in terms of, what's important to them and address the career and development challenge. So I'm curious around the performance piece, because I guess if the team wasn't performing, how did you set clear expectations for the team to shift and transform performance?
It was interesting. So the very high engagement team had the lowest performance. And across when I look at performance, it's generally in a block, right? I look at the 2 teams combined. And when you looked at them, they were below expectation, but not super far below. And that was because there was essentially like a multiple speed economy going on in these teams, where there were a lot of individuals who were performing at a very high level, producing a lot of very high quality work. And there were some individuals that were producing an extremely low volume of work, which was also not in line with the expectations of the organization. We're using practices. You mentioned predecessor schemes for AFCA. Those predecessor schemes had predecessor schemes as well. And some of the practices were from 2 steps back that had just never been brought in line with current organizational expectations. And really, those organizational expectations are built in modern understandings of comprehension, of accessibility. And there were some groups that were producing these extremely verbose, long, legalistic documents that were inaccessible to the general public, which is something that is really close to my heart as a leader at AFCA, because it is so close to our values and core to our strategy. So in this 100% engagement team, this team didn't have the usual guardrails that any other team at AFCA would have. And so the work being produced was generating further work down the line in service complaints, in feedback. And as I said, there were some parties performing low, some parties performing high. When I looked at the other team, the work was in line with our expectations. It was still of high quality. There was a lot of hard work going on. But I also noticed that the profile of work that they were working on was actually much more complex. They were receiving more of the harder work, which in a complaint context, the more technical and the more of the parties that are experiencing vulnerability increases the time to resolve, because there's just more communication, there's more information to break down. So this second team, the engagement was lower, but their overall production, their overall quality was very high. And that's where breaking down these results, if you go further in, there's often some real gems in those surveys. And one of the things that really shone out to me across both teams was a feeling that we at a resentment for the fact that management didn't address underperformance of the teams. And clearly, like it was clear to me on the data that some people were really carrying the torch for the team and some people were very much not. That was obvious to those teams and that was obvious to the members of those teams in there. And there was that real feeling of imbalance and a lack of fairness. Now, if listeners know anything about the Australian Financial Complaints Authority or are just doing a quick Google, fairness is core to what we do, to everything we do. It is one of our organizational values. And in my humble opinion, is the preeminent value that drives us. It's what brings people to work with us. It's what drives that very high level of satisfaction in the work that we do. And there is that, it's not just a desire, it's an expectation that fairness will be applied. And as well, I've got a cohort of very highly skilled people who apply a fairness lens every day in every interaction. And so they're very practiced at spotting imbalance and working to correct that. And so that jam was really the driver for me to dive deeper into the data, dive deeper into the practices of the team and understand what was going on. And also to drive clarity for those people who were not meeting expectations in order to, and support to give them the tools to lift to that level.
There's so many different threads I want to pull right now, but I'm going to go to the data and insight side of things. So it sounds like both for the employee engagement results, but also how you're measuring performance, that you've got a lot of data to inform and make insights. How do you use data to make insights and inform decisions that you're making? Because it sounds like it's probably core to your leadership approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Emotion and off the cuff and engagement, all these things are critical, I think, and respecting people, but also, again, evidence-based organization that deals in fairness. And so I have to deal in evidence. I think any argument or position, it's really critical that it's backed by hard evidence. And while data, depending on the parameters, 62% of statistics are made up, I believe.
I thought it was 75%. That's
Yeah.
okay.
Data is critical to that. And we have a lot of measures that we've developed over many years to demonstrate whether cases are flowing through our process in a timely way, that fairness is being applied, that the customer experience is very high. All of that data is great and is useful. But the data that I needed to interrogate to get behind these things, and I guess it comes back clear to that listening, right? And to that understanding, what is the pain point for these teams? What is the challenge? And so I was able to then dig into data that I didn't usually look at. So I looked at the spread of tools that I had, and there were certainly indications there, but it really required a pinpoint approach where there seemed to be hints of an imbalance. And so it required me to go in and pull information from our system about what work was going where on a case by case basis, and then analyze that to show the proportion of what was more complex, more challenging work, where that was going, where the perhaps easier work, not that any of our work is easy, but I like to term some of these as like palate cleansers or a moose bouche for my caseworkers, where they can tackle something that, is less document and evidence dense, is more about talking on the phone, is more about explaining practice to people, just to give that change in pace. And when I dug into that data, what I found was that all of those palate cleansers were going to the 100% engagement team. And they were particularly focused on those people whose work was not aligned with the organizational expectation. And it was really those people were in most cases already underperforming for targets. And that simpler work was then being funneled to them, which was buffering their performance and in some ways hiding that. And there was this real imbalance across the two teams. So the data was critical to not only like formation of understanding of what was going on here, what was the problem, but it was the hints from the general feeling of the team that really drove that and allowed me to verify it.
Yeah. So you've got this data point where there's a bit of an imbalance within the team and between the teams in terms of the lower performers doing the easier work. There's more complex work. So what did you do? Like, fairness is obviously a core value. What did you do to balance that fairness or distribute the work so that you could hold people accountable to the performance expectations?
Yeah, to be honest, it was a really difficult journey and a slow one. And that when I talk about my prior experience in transformation and change management and changing teams, that was one of the main lessons that I had learned was about really slowing down. And it's about how you eat an elephant, right? You eat one bite at a time. And make sure that you can chew that bite. And there were individual instances that required addressing. The leader of the team with the very high engagement my impression was extremely reluctant to engage these practices with the underperformers. And so the first step was engaging with that manager to look at those practices and engage coaching and support programs for the people who were underperforming. And as that occurred, more and more data became available, which highlighted, in fact, where a lot of the drivers for this were. And the conclusion really was that the manager for the high engagement team had very high engagement because the work being distributed was being chosen by that manager for its lower complexity level and distributed to mask some of that underperformance. And so as we engaged in coaching and support programs, it became more and more obvious and the data became more and more undeniable that these practices were occurring. And so the performance development led to actually, in regards to team members, led to actually performance development conversations with the leader themselves around the expectations and the practices that had been engaging in. I think like when it's a very highly tenured team, long, very highly skilled, where a team has been essentially allowed to run their own race and engage their own practice, and that practice is not in line with organizational values, the longer the term prior, the more entrenched that team is in that practice, the more resistant they are to any change. And so the production of that evidence around what these practices were, the discussion with that leader around what the expectations were and what we needed to do going forward was a real shock to that person. And they reacted in a way that when we deal with these things, we're all individuals and we all have different experiences. We bring different life experience, different understanding, and to be honest, different levels of emotional maturity to these things. That leader, in being presented with this information and being presented with the plan to change that, didn't want to engage with that. And so that led to that leader deciding to move on off their own bat. And while actually a huge technical knowledge loss to the organization, actually set those teams free from those practices and allowed us to then change that high level practice at the management level and slowly adjust that imbalance over time. And that was really the key to shifting everything in those teams.
What I notice is often when we re-clarify what the new expectations are and people aren't on board with that or they're not signed up to it, I think a great outcome for the leader, for the team, for the organization is when people do self-select out, because leadership is a choice. And if people aren't on board, there's no point in having someone who's resisting what accountability and what expectations look like too. So, like, how have you noticed the performance of that team or both the teams shift over time? Like,
Oh
what
my
have you
gosh.
noticed?
Wild, Claire. Absolutely wild. So because the trust was built, because that trust and was built and around a truthful acknowledgement of the skill and capability. My opinion of these teams has only grown from there. They are some of the best teams I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Just unbelievable skill sets and drive and I guess dedication to the work that we do, which is again one of the many bonuses of working in a not-for-profit based in fairness. But there, once we evened the playing field and we went through those bite-sized pieces and we introduced piece by piece accountability for these new practices, and all of that always was started from this is why this is important, right? This is what this affects, these practices affect. And it's not only the people you're assisting, the people you're working with or the organization, but the impacts on those individual people about like how it reflected on them, how it enhanced or hamstrung their progression, their growth, their individual professional reputations within the organization. All of these things were, each piece had to be sort of teased out, explored in multiple conversations where the team have the security to express really clearly whatever's on their mind. So there's a tool that I use to do that, which I've stolen from my theatre friends, which is the space of unconditional positive regard. And that allows them to really, as I like to say in my little spiels, feed it to me. Like, do not be afraid to tell me whatever is on your mind. And essentially, when you do, I expect that when you are frustrated, that there will be frustration in your delivery. I expect that you are a human being and an emotional creature and that emotion will shine through. And I want everyone to understand that I will view them positively without condition, no matter what happens in these spaces. I want them to be able to freely express their feelings, their concerns, their fears. And in the same way that when I'm engaging in that space with them, I need that same permission. I need that same freedom as well. And what that means is that sometimes that those concerns I often find are based in a lack of information or a lack of understanding about the broader picture or the effects of those things and the why. And so it gives this wonderful space to like challenge and engage. And when we're in the business of balancing two conflicted parties, right, who are adversarial, they are in different positions. And so we are very used to interrogating arguments from different perspectives. And that helps a lot, I think. So they were able to tell me what was on their minds, tell me what was challenging them, and tell me why they might have been resistant to any of those pieces. And we were able to address that in real time to build their understanding, to demonstrate to them the effect, while at the same time supporting their needs. So essentially, once we'd worked through all of that, this team felt so heard, so supported, so fairly treated. We did have some people move on to other roles. And I think in the same way with the manager, they found those changes very challenging after years of practice. We supported them to achieve career progression that they wanted, whether that be up or sideways into different work. We were very clear about what our view of their work and their expectation. But it winnowed down the team. The team reduced in size over time, but the production of that team and the quality of that work leapt up like immediately. And we went from having a team producing somewhere between sort of 70 to 90 variably percent of expectation to 150% plus every month. And it was really like the people who were there wanted to be there. They wanted to do the work. They wanted to do it the way that the organization expected. And I hesitate to say right, because utopia is always over the horizon and there's always more to build or do, but they felt empowered, they felt uplifted, and we celebrated that with them in so many ways and so often and so much that it's continued and continues now. So that the effect of, and as well, the engagement of both teams then lifted to 100, which is always just makes my heart sing as a leader when a team is happy and they feel supported. And when I'm doing my job and I'm listening properly and I'm hearing them and they see that I can, they see that I will do whatever I can to support them. And also I can explain to them why or what happened when I'm unable to get the thing that they want.
Yeah. Because I'm hearing that the unconditional positive regard really links really closely to psychological safety. So people feel like they can be themselves, can share how they're feeling without risk of there being a negative consequence, laying that foundation for both yourself, but also for the team and that expectation, but also creating an environment that actions speak louder than words too. But it does sound like also people are really motivated, especially if you're at sort of 150% of expectations. That's a huge, huge uplift.
And it's like, it's been for a long time now that they've been at that point. Like when it started, I was like, oh, this may be a burst, right? Like and we'd ask them for help with the work, but they have just continued at that pace. And for it to go so long, I hope it's a reflection of that engagement, of that feeling of support and trust, and that acknowledgement of their incredible skill sets.
Mm. You mentioned before that it's a highly tenured team. Obviously, things shifted when the manager moved on, but often change is met with resistance, like you said. How did you address some of that resistance that you might have seen based on the new way of working?
Yeah, I guess like it really comes back to that candor, that ability to express, like the psychological safety created
Mm.
by the unconditional positive regard activity just allows them to freely express their concerns. And my ability to freely respond to that in that space means that we're able to bring our genuine selves there. And there is no pretense. There is no, I'm a very, like, I'm a very transparent person. And I want to be transparent in all actions that I take. I think as a leader, there are often things you cannot speak to. Right? There are confidential matters or confidential decisions that are influencing your decision making that you cannot speak to. But what I always try to speak to is the general feel or driver behind that decision making. So when a challenge comes up and there are elements of that I can't talk to, I will say there are elements of this that I cannot talk to. There are parts of this that I cannot talk to, but what I can talk to you about is our high level thinking and the drivers behind any decision making here. And so understanding that, I guess, strategic or organizational level view of these matters and why these decisions are made just gives them a clarity to that. And so I think that every challenge that they raise, some of them will result in changes in practice and changes in approach, but some of them cannot be. And I think that it needs to be fair around that. It's okay to say, this will not change. And this is why, and this is the broader effect. And while I understand the negative individual impact here, it's a greater good situation, I guess, for the organization.
Yeah. So you mentioned the unconditional positive regard activity. Is there a particular activity that you do with your team that helps them understand psychological safety?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a spiel, I guess, that I roll out with the teams. So we're a hybrid workplace. So there's some in office, some online. all of our larger meetings are generally online because of the differing needs of our people. But I start every session with, I want this today to be a space of unconditional positive regard. So complex phrase. So let's take a moment to understand what that means. Unconditional, no matter what happens, positive regard. I am going to view each of you positively, no matter what happens in this session. I already do, and I will continue to do so. And no matter what we say, no matter how this goes, no matter how upset any of us gets or raw this is a safe space. And I understand and accept that each of us are human beings, we're emotional creatures, and things can affect us deeply and personally. And so when we express those things, sometimes it's almost impossible to remove the emotion. And sometimes it's actually way more beneficial to that individual. It's cathartic to express that. And in this space, I want everybody engaged in this space to feel free to express to me, at me, how they feel. And that will never change. What we say in here is safe. It will never change how I feel about you or the way I view you, which is baseline positively. But I need that safety too, to engage here. And so what I would ask is that you give me that same permission. And what that will mean is that sometimes when you raise these things, my responses may feel direct, but I promise you that they will always be honest. I will always tell you as much information as I possibly can. And I will highlight to you when there's stuff going on in that answer that I'm not able to share. And when I do that, I'll give you the high level sort of thinking behind decision making. But so it is like, I want this to be a space of unconditional positive regard. And the key to that is active agreement. So then I go around the room and I ask every individual person to say specifically, I am happy to participate and abide by the rules of unconditional positive regard. And that active agreement is, and it's fine for people to say, actually, I'm not comfortable with that. And when that's the case, I say, no problem. I will take this offline with you in a one-on-one setting so that it is a much safer space for you. And I'm happy to receive any feedback in whatever way suits you best.
It's almost that intention setting, because often up front we want to set what's the intention of what we're bringing to the meeting, and everyone might have a slightly different intention that they're bringing, but if it's held in that positive regard, that really helps. Because I guess you mentioned the word candor before, and I talk about how do teams have healthy, challenging debate? How do they get everything on the table that needs to be said? So you've got the unconditional positive regard as an intention setting framework, but then how do you actually encourage that candor or challenging, healthy debate?
Questioning, I guess, like gentle questioning of positions. So when somebody delivers a piece of feedback, it's often got so many things behind it that are not spoken. And we can assume what those things are, but it tends to make an ass out of you and me. So I do ask those questions to better understand the drivers behind those feelings. I will speak if someone raises something and I'll say, okay, so can you help me understand, why do you feel like that? What is the thing that sort of is making you, is there something particular? Is it a general vibe, or is it a specific instance? And this practice is something I engage in regularly, right? And with all of the teams, all of the people that I lead. And initially, because I've done it so many times and with so many different people, initially it didn't land as effectively as I wanted. It definitely drew much more information out, but I didn't feel that everyone truly believed that it was a space of unconditional positive regard. And it is not until I did it with a group of like 300 participants, so our whole department in one space in an operational meeting, I set that expectation and I got savaged, to be honest. It's one of those things where, you've got to be, I think you've got to be careful around addressing difficult matters in large spaces because you can get lynched essentially by your people if there's something you're unaware of. And you have to be ready for that, right? I think you have to be ready and open to that. And it's a lot about setting ego aside or minimizing ego as much as possible and seeing the person and truly, genuinely having a positive view of all people and an understanding about the variation, the beauty and variation of humans. But yeah, I got like absolutely savaged by a couple of people. And it's become a bit of a running joke about my dealing with that because I responded with emotion too, right? But because that's based in my genuine care for people, I acknowledged how they felt. And I acknowledged that actually, like one of the questions was, I think, around performance management and our practice and how we go to that. And there's this very funny thing that everyone feeds back to me about. Apparently, I don't remember it at all, but I took my glasses off and put them down. Did these ones, and I let rip about like how emotional that is for us as leaders, how devastating, how much we tear ourselves apart about whether we're doing the right thing, about how we're supporting these people and whether we're doing it appropriately. And that we've put all these checks in place, not necessarily to restrict the person that might be being developed, but to check that the leader is doing the right thing. So like, and then those people who had confronted me in this large meeting, I made conscious effort after that, like a really conscious effort to, on the floor, in the office, be checking in with them, to be providing like outcomes from the feedback that they'd been given in a broader sense, to really show through action and deed that these people were viewed positively and it is safe to challenge. And again, it comes back to that, like all these words, all this flowery grace, but unless you walk the walk, it's just words. And people quickly become disillusioned.
Yeah. And I think it's about what I'm noticing in that story is showing vulnerability and showing that we are human and we do have emotional reactions to things, but also how do we move forward from that, take action too.
Yeah.
So you're in a leader of leader role. By leader of leader, I mean you lead other leaders. You've got multiple teams that sit underneath you. Through this transformation, or also just in your role as a leader of leader, what have you learnt about yourself?
Oh gosh, about myself, so much wild, right? And I hinted at that earlier, I guess, about that I had been through similar transformations before and stumbled and made errors in judgment around, for me, particularly around the first step as a leader was understanding the different drivers of different people and the different expectations they had of themselves and others. And that certainly that's never aligned. And that's a complex sort of minefield to discover. And that I'd gone too hard, too fast on changes in the past. My number one would be, for me personally, is about taking my time with things, is about not getting too excited and taking it piece by piece. I think I find it's funny. I find leadership courses and learning so valuable and are often so closely aligned with like psychological or counseling practice. There, I go to I go to leadership courses sometimes, and I'm just so amazed that the conversation I'm having in this leadership course is actually reflecting the same conversation I'm having in therapy, which I think therapy is so useful, not to go off track, but in discovering about yourself and understanding your own self. And I think we assume that we do, but I have ADHD, and that's part of who I am and part of my strengths, but also the driver of some of my weaknesses. And understanding who I am, understanding what drives me and how that might be different to others, and what others might be thinking, has been so key to my success as a leader. And then to see that mirrored in leadership courses about understanding yourself and all of these personality profiles we examine and all of these ways we interrogate or review our actions or instincts are so valuable. And it can be really challenging. And I guess the main thing I always say to the people in my teams, my leaders, is be not afraid. And you will be challenged. And sometimes it'll take some time to digest that. But every piece of feedback is a gift and an opportunity to enhance your practice.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. And I do think there's a lot of links between therapy and self-awareness, and therapy and relationships and interpersonal differences and all the things that we can get in knots about. I was actually reading on about AFCA, and it sounds like they do a lot for neurodivergent people within teams. Is there any things that you'd share that AFCA does well in the context of neurodiversity within teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's an incredibly accepting environment at ACT. And I think that's one of the things for me that makes it just such a wonderful place to be, because bringing your true and genuine self to work is desired, is encouraged. And I guess like the ways in which we do that, there is visibility. We have panels about neurodivergent people of different kinds, about the challenges they've faced, vulnerability in sharing that, and transparency about those journeys. We've built support networks, which are groupings of my neurospicy brethren, where we share tips and learnings and challenges, and we're always ready to jump in and support each other. And there's this such value, like such incredible value in having a diverse group of minds attack problems from different angles, work together to build this rich picture of possibility and of the challenge that we face. And I've just seen it be so successful in helping people feel empowered and valued in their difference. And it's just, as someone who's neurodivergent, is a very emotional and beautiful thing to be a part of.
Yeah. So, my final question is, if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would it be?
I think all of this that we've spoken about today, all of the approaches, all of the like the bringing out of it, feeling, none of that works unless it is grounded in a genuine belief and feeling of care, a genuine acceptance of difference and in approach, and the need to, as a leader, in my view, you have to be so malleable and stretchable, and at the same time provide resistance, tension. You have to flex and grow and listen and respond genuinely, truthfully, but also that knowing your own self and knowing your own drivers is critical to that, and being true to yourself. If you are not genuine, people know. If you try to exhibit something that isn't there, people know. And that erodes trust so quickly. And it's so hard to build back.
Yeah, I love it. I love the focusing on care to build trust, really understanding our similarities and differences and valuing that diversity, but also being genuine and authentic to who you are. Yeah.
And then it relates back to the accountability. You relate back to the accountability, the expectations of the organization, the mission, the why, all of those things. They just all feed in together beautifully. Yeah, it makes life and work so much more enjoyable. But I have to say, it's so nice when people feel themselves safe, and it's just I spend so much of my time when I'm in the office laughing and smiling and hearing stories of the people I work with because of that trust. Makes it a joy to be there.
Yeah. And I think safety, from what you've said today, it isn't necessarily just about being nice. You still have the challenging conversations, but it's doing it in a way that's respectful of people and people feel seen. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
No, me too, Claire. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. What an incredibly rich and honest conversation. Greg reminded us that thriving teams aren't just about high performance, they're about clarity, trust, and connection at every level. I was struck by how he used data and insights, not just to measure, but to listen, to uncover the deeper story behind what was really happening within the team, both from an engagement, performance, and a fairness perspective. Setting clear expectations and holding people accountable doesn't have to feel cold. It can actually be one of the most respectful things we do as leaders. Greg showed us that when we lead with intention and vulnerability and create the conditions for psychological safety, people feel seen, they feel valued, and they show up. Not just as workers, but as whole humans. If today's episode sparked any reflection for you in terms of how you lead your team, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining the Thriving Leaders podcast. Keep on thriving. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.